If you don't trust me, then just leave already. I'm tired of defending every friendship I have. Those words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, delivered by someone I'd been planning to propose to within the next 6 months. I stood in our Salt Lake City apartment, holding Hazel's phone in my trembling hands, staring at text messages that had shattered my world in the span of 30 seconds. The conversation thread with someone named Jay was full of inside jokes, weekend plans, and a casual intimacy that made my stomach turn. Messages about shared experiences I knew nothing about, references to conversations that had apparently been happening behind my back for weeks or maybe months. I'd noticed Hazel being protective of her phone lately, angling it away from me during dinner or taking it to the bathroom when she never used to, but I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. Working as a geothermal energy consultant meant I spent long hours analyzing data and identifying patterns in underground thermal systems, but apparently I'd been blind to the patterns happening right in front of me in my own relationship. When I'd asked her about the late-night buzzing from her phone the past few weeks, she'd laughed it off as work-related group chats about upcoming wedding shoots, claiming her photographer colleagues were night owls who shared ideas and client updates at all hours. I wanted to believe her because I loved her, because we'd been together for 2 years, because I'd started shopping for engagement rings and imagining our future together in this apartment we'd made into our home. But seeing those messages changed everything about how I understood our relationship. The way Jay referenced things they'd done together, places they'd been, conversations they'd shared, it read like two people who knew each other far better than casual friends should, with an intimacy that made my chest tighten with a mixture of hurt and recognition. When I confronted her about it, asking who this person was and why their messages felt so intimate and secretive, Hazel's response wasn't explanation or reassurance or even a reasonable denial. Instead, she immediately went on the defensive, accusing me of invading her privacy and being controlling, her entire demeanor shifting from the loving girlfriend I thought I knew to someone I barely recognized. She stood there in our kitchen, her face flushed with anger and something that looked almost like panic, telling me I was becoming paranoid and toxic, that I was trying to isolate her from her friends and turn into one of those possessive boyfriends she'd always claimed to hate. The irony wasn't lost on me that a woman who'd always praised my thoughtful, steady nature and said she loved how secure and trusting I was compared to her previous boyfriends was now painting me as some kind of jealous monster for noticing obvious inconsistencies in her behavior and stories. She flipped the entire situation around with practiced ease, making me the problem for discovering something she'd been hiding, rather than addressing why she was hiding it in the first place or who this person really was in her life. The argument escalated quickly, with her voice rising as she accused me of not trusting her, of being insecure and jealous, of trying to control who she talked to and where she went, painting a picture of me that felt completely foreign to who I knew myself to be. I kept my voice calm and measured, asking simple, reasonable questions about who this person was and why she felt the need to keep their friendship secret from someone she supposedly loved and trusted enough to share an apartment and a life with. But every question just made her more defensive, more angry, more determined to make this about my character flaws rather than her secretive behavior. That's when she delivered the ultimatum that would change everything between us and force me to confront some hard truths about the relationship I'd thought was heading toward marriage. She told me that if I couldn't trust her completely, without question or curiosity, then I should just leave rather than continue to make her life miserable with my suspicions. She was tired of defending every friendship she had, tired of my questions and observations, tired of feeling like she had to prove herself to someone who was supposed to love her unconditionally. Standing there listening to her, I realized she wasn't denying anything about the messages or explaining who Jay was. She was just angry that I'd discovered something she'd been keeping hidden, and she was making that discovery my fault rather than taking responsibility for the secrecy itself. I spent that night on the couch, staring at the ceiling and questioning everything I thought I knew about our relationship and about myself as a partner. Was I really being controlling and paranoid like she claimed, or was I having a normal response to discovering secretive behavior from someone I trusted? Was it normal for couples to have completely private friendships that included intimate conversations and secret plans? Or was I right to feel like something fundamental had shifted in our relationship? I'd been in serious relationships before, and I'd never felt the need to monitor anyone's communications or question their friendships, because previous partners had been open about their social lives and included me naturally in their world. But I'd also never been with someone who made me feel like I was losing my mind for noticing obvious inconsistencies in their stories or asking basic questions about their day and their plans. The next morning, while I was getting ready for work and still processing everything that had happened the night before, Hazel announced she was leaving for Miami that weekend for what she described as a spontaneous girls' trip. She said it was something she'd organized with her college sorority sisters, a long-planned vacation she'd apparently been looking forward to for weeks but had somehow never mentioned to me in any of our daily conversations about work and plans and life. When I asked for basic details about the trip, where they were staying, which friends were going, when she'd be back, simple information that couples typically share about travel plans, she accused me of more controlling behavior. She said I was proving her point about not trusting her, that my questions were exactly the kind of paranoid monitoring she was tired of dealing with, and that normal boyfriends didn't interrogate their girlfriends about every detail of their social lives. I watched her pack designer clothes I'd helped pay for into a suitcase I'd bought her for her birthday, and wondered when asking about my girlfriend's travel plans had become an unreasonable request that made me a controlling partner rather than someone who cared about her safety and wanted to be included in the major events of her life. While Hazel packed for her mysterious Miami trip, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously ignored or rationalized away. I noticed she was deleting message threads immediately after reading them, something she'd never done in the 2 years we'd been together when she used to leave her phone casually around our apartment without any concern about privacy. She'd also turned off location sharing on her phone, a feature we'd both used since moving in together as a practical way to coordinate our schedules and know when the other person was running late or had made it safely to work. When I mentioned the location change, asking if it was accidental, she claimed her phone had been glitchy lately and she was troubling technical issues, but I worked with technology every day and knew that location services don't just randomly disable themselves. The inconsistencies were adding up in ways that my analytical mind couldn't ignore, even though part of me desperately wanted to believe her explanations and return to the comfortable trust we'd once shared. I started paying closer attention to her stories about work and her social life, and I began noticing gaps and contradictions that made my stomach churn with growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong. She'd mentioned working late at home editing photos from recent weddings, but when I'd check our shared streaming accounts or notice the patterns of our internet usage, there was no evidence of the intensive computer work that should have accompanied hours of photo editing and client communications. Instead, I found evidence of something else entirely when I discovered a credit card statement she'd left on her desk while packing. The statement showed expensive restaurant charges in downtown Salt Lake City on multiple nights over the past month, meals at upscale establishments that cost more than we typically spent on our date nights together. These charges corresponded exactly with nights she told me she was working late at home, editing photos and responding to client emails until well past midnight. The amounts were clearly for 2 people, sometimes including expensive wine pairings and appetizers that suggested romantic dinners rather than solo work sessions or quick meals with female colleagues. I sat in our apartment, holding this evidence of deception, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet as I realized how extensively she'd been lying to me about her whereabouts and activities. The betrayal wasn't just about potential infidelity, it was about the systematic way she'd been gaslighting me, making me feel paranoid and controlling for noticing things that were actually happening right in front of me. I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if my instincts were correct, so I reached out to Casey, a mutual friend who worked in Salt Lake City's photography community and would potentially know about Hazel's professional activities and social circle. Casey had always been straightforward with me, and I trusted her to give me honest information even if it was difficult to hear. When I asked her about Hazel's work schedule and recent projects, Casey was quiet for a long moment before reluctantly sharing what she'd observed over the past few months. She told me that Hazel had been seen multiple times at upscale bars and restaurants in downtown Salt Lake City, but she wasn't with her usual female friend group or photography colleagues. Instead, she'd been consistently spotted with the same man, someone Casey didn't recognize from their shared professional circles but who appeared to be significantly older and well-dressed, clearly comfortable spending money at expensive venues. Casey had assumed it was a wealthy potential client, maybe someone planning a high-end destination wedding who was being wined and dined as part of Hazel's business development strategy. But the frequency of these sightings and the intimate body language Casey described made it clear that these weren't professional meetings or casual friendships, but something much more personal and secretive. The timeline Casey provided matched perfectly with the credit card charges and the nights Hazel had claimed to be working late at home, creating a clear pattern of deception that I could no longer rationalize or explain away. Sitting in our apartment after that conversation, surrounded by shared belongings and photos from our supposedly happy relationship, I felt a strange combination of vindication and devastation. I'd been right to trust my instincts about her behavior, but being right meant accepting that the woman I loved had been systematically lying to me for months while making me feel crazy for noticing obvious signs of her deception. I realized that Hazel had been gaslighting me in the most insidious way possible, using my own desire to trust her and maintain our relationship against me by framing my legitimate concerns as character flaws and relationship toxicity. She turned my love for her into a weapon to keep me confused and compliant while she pursued whatever this other relationship was, making me complicit in my own betrayal by convincing me that questioning her obvious lies made me a bad boyfriend. The decision crystallized in my mind with startling clarity as I sat there processing everything I'd discovered and finally acknowledging what I'd been trying so hard to deny. I could no longer stay in a relationship where I was being systematically deceived and manipulated, where my valid concerns were being twisted into evidence of my inadequacy as a partner. I realized that trusting myself and my observations was more important than preserving a relationship built on lies, and that staying would only enable more deception and further damage to my self-respect and mental health. I made the difficult but necessary decision to trust my instincts rather than continue enabling her deception by pretending I didn't notice the obvious signs of her betrayal. I took 3 personal days from work, telling my supervisor at the geothermal consulting firm that I was dealing with a family emergency that required my immediate attention and focus. While Hazel enjoyed what she believed would be a consequence-free trip to Miami, celebrating what she probably thought was her successful manipulation of a trusting boyfriend, I began quietly planning my exit strategy from our shared life and apartment. I spent the first day of Hazel's absence methodically researching my options and creating a detailed plan for extricating myself from our shared living situation with minimal drama and maximum efficiency. Working as a consultant had taught me the importance of thorough planning and documentation, skills that proved invaluable as I navigated the logistics of ending a 2-year relationship and shared household. I started by securing temporary housing, finding a furnished month-to-month rental across town in a complex that catered to professionals in transition, people going through divorces or job relocations who needed flexibility rather than long-term commitments. The apartment was smaller than what Hazel and I shared, but it was clean, quiet, and most importantly, it was entirely mine without any shared history or memories attached to the walls and furniture. I opened a separate bank account at a different branch of my credit union, ensuring that I had complete financial independence and that Hazel couldn't access or monitor my transactions during what I anticipated might be a difficult transition period. I'd learned enough about manipulation tactics to know that people who gaslight their partners often escalate their behavior when they realize they're losing control, and I wanted to protect myself from any potential financial retaliation or attempts to complicate my departure. The second day was devoted to the practical aspects of documenting our shared belongings and preparing for the physical move itself. I methodically photographed every item in our apartment, creating a time-stamped digital record of everything we'd purchased together versus items I'd brought into the relationship or bought independently with my own money. This wasn't about being petty or fighting over material possessions, but rather about protecting myself from potential accusations or legal complications that might arise if Hazel decided to claim I'd stolen things that belonged to her or that we'd purchased together. I contacted the utility companies and our internet provider, transferring all the shared accounts into Hazel's name only and ensuring that final bills would be sent directly to her rather than creating ongoing financial entanglements between us. I spoke with our landlord about removing myself from the lease, explaining that I was ending a relationship and needed to terminate my tenancy obligations immediately. The early termination fee was substantial, nearly $2,000, but I paid it in full without hesitation because the cost of my freedom and peace of mind was worth far more than any amount of money. I arranged for a moving company to handle the physical removal of my belongings, scheduling them for Friday afternoon while Hazel was still in Miami, and I provided them with detailed instructions about which items belonged to me versus shared purchases I was choosing to leave behind. I didn't want anything that would create ongoing conflict or give her reasons to contact me after I left, so I decided to take only my personal belongings, clothing, books, electronics I'd owned before the relationship, and furniture I'd brought from my previous apartment. Everything we'd purchased together for our shared life, the couch we'd spent weeks picking out, the kitchen appliances we'd registered for like an engaged couple, the artwork we'd chosen together to make our apartment feel like home, I left behind for her to keep or dispose of as she chose. On Thursday, her final day in Miami based on the itinerary she'd refused to share with me, I watched her Instagram stories showing beach parties, expensive spa treatments, and group photos with women I didn't recognize despite her claims that these were her close sorority sisters from college. The disconnect between her social media presentation and the reality of our relationship problems was jarring, seeing her post about living her best life and embracing freedom while I sat in our apartment preparing to leave the life we'd built together. I spent that evening writing and rewriting a note to leave for her, trying to find words that would explain my decision without being cruel or accusatory, while also making it clear that my departure was final and not a dramatic gesture designed to get her attention or force a reconciliation. I wanted to be honest about why I was leaving without giving her ammunition to use against me or opportunities to manipulate the narrative in ways that would make me the villain in the story she'd inevitably tell our mutual friends. The note went through multiple drafts as I struggled to balance truth-telling with self-protection, ultimately settling on something direct but not inflammatory that would close the door on our relationship without slamming it shut. Friday morning, I did a final walkthrough of our apartment, taking photos of everything exactly as I was leaving it to protect myself from any claims that I'd damaged property or taken things that weren't mine. I left my key on the kitchen counter next to the handwritten note, and I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief as I closed the door behind me for the final time. The note read simply, "You were right, when trust is gone, it's time to leave. I chose to trust myself instead of believing your version of reality. The utilities are now in your name, and I've fulfilled my lease obligations. Please don't contact me." I drove directly to the leasing office and formally surrendered my copy of the apartment key to the property manager, ensuring there was an official record of my departure and that I couldn't be accused of retaining access to Hazel's living space. By Friday evening, while Hazel was presumably preparing to return home from her Miami trip, I was sitting in my new apartment surrounded by boxes and feeling like I'd escaped from something that could have destroyed my sense of reality and self-worth if I'd allowed it to continue. The silence in my new space felt different from the tense quiet that had characterized our apartment in recent weeks. This was peaceful silence, the absence of deception and manipulation, rather than the charged atmosphere of unspoken lies and growing suspicion that had made our home feel like a battlefield where I was constantly defending my right to notice obvious inconsistencies in my partner's behavior and stories. Hazel returned from Miami late Sunday evening to discover empty closets, missing furniture, and the devastating reality that her boyfriend had vanished along with any trace of his presence in what had been their shared home. I knew this because she immediately began calling my phone, not once or twice, but 17 times in the span of 2 hours, each call going straight to voicemail because I'd blocked her number before leaving my note on Friday. The voicemails, which I could see notifications for but couldn't access due to the block, continued throughout the night and into Monday morning, creating a digital paper trail of her escalating panic and fury. When the phone calls proved futile, she reached out to our mutual friends, demanding explanations and expecting sympathy for what she portrayed as a sudden, inexplicable abandonment by an unstable boyfriend who'd left without warning or reason. She contacted Casey first, probably because she knew we'd been friends before Hazel and I started dating, but Casey had already been briefed about my discovery of Hazel's deception and was supportive of my decision to leave rather than continue enabling lies and manipulation. Most of our mutual friends had quietly suspected something was off about Hazel's behavior over the past few months, noticing the same inconsistencies in her stories that had been making me feel crazy, and they weren't surprised to learn that I'd finally trusted my instincts and removed myself from what had become a toxic situation. Instead of the unified support she expected, Hazel found herself having to defend her version of events to people who had observed her secretive behavior and contradictory explanations firsthand. She created a series of social media posts designed to control the narrative, portraying herself as the victim of an unstable boyfriend who couldn't handle her independence and success. The posts talked about toxic masculinity and controlling partners, painting me as someone who tried to isolate her from friends and monitor her every move, but the narrative fell flat because people who knew us could see through the obvious projection and manipulation. Our friends remembered how supportive I'd been of her career, how I'd helped her build her photography business by connecting her with potential clients through my professional network, and how I'd encouraged her friendships and social activities without ever trying to control or limit her independence. The contrast between her social media victim narrative and the reality of our relationship was so stark that it actually made people more suspicious of her behavior rather than sympathetic to her situation. 3 weeks after I'd moved out, Hazel escalated her attempts to contact me by showing up at my workplace, somehow having discovered the location of my consulting firm's offices despite my efforts to maintain complete separation from her. She arrived during business hours, demanding to speak with me and creating a scene in the lobby when the receptionist informed her that I wasn't available and couldn't be disturbed during work hours. Security had to escort her from the building after she refused to leave voluntarily, insisting that she had a right to speak with me about our shared possessions and financial obligations, neither of which were actually unresolved since I'd documented everything and paid all termination fees before leaving. I was forced to involve human resources and building security, filing a formal report about harassment and requesting that my personal information be kept confidential and that additional security measures be implemented to prevent future incidents. The HR meeting was embarrassing and professionally awkward, having to explain to my supervisor and colleagues that I was dealing with a personal situation that had the potential to affect workplace safety and security, but my employer was supportive and understanding about implementing protections. I maintained complete no contact throughout all of these escalating attempts to reach me, having researched manipulation tactics and learned about the importance of maintaining strict boundaries when dealing with someone who had systematically gaslighted and deceived me for months. Everything I read about emotional manipulation and toxic relationships confirmed that responding to any of her attempts at contact would only encourage further escalation and give her hope that she could eventually wear down my resolve and convince me to return to the dysfunctional dynamic we'd been trapped in. I documented every attempt she made to contact me, every social media post that referenced our relationship, and every incident at my workplace, creating a comprehensive record that I hoped I'd never need but wanted to have available if her behavior continued to escalate in ways that threatened my safety or professional reputation. 2 weeks after Hazel's workplace harassment incident, Qley reached out with information that confirmed everything I'd suspected but hadn't been able to prove about the mysterious J from those intimate text messages I'd discovered on her phone. She told me that after doing some discreet investigation within Salt Lake City's tight-knit creative community, she'd learned that J was actually Jake Morrison, a married colleague from Hazel's photography network who specialized in high-end commercial shoots and had a reputation for being both talented and financially successful. The affair had been ongoing for approximately 6 months, starting around the time Hazel had begun acting secretive and protective about her phone, which meant that her gaslighting and manipulation of me had been deliberate and sustained rather than a momentary lapse in judgment or confusion about her feelings. Qley revealed that Hazel's supposed Miami girls trip had actually been a cover story for a romantic weekend getaway to Park City with Jake, where they'd stayed at an expensive resort that neither of them could have afforded on their legitimate photography incomes alone. The elaborate deception required to pull off this fake Miami trip while actually being 3 hours away in Utah's mountains demonstrated a level of premeditation and calculated dishonesty that made my stomach turn as I realized how extensively she'd been lying to me while making me feel paranoid for noticing obvious inconsistencies. The situation became even more complicated and devastating when Qley explained that Jake's wife had recently discovered the affair through credit card statements and suspicious behavior patterns that mirrored what I'd been observing in my own relationship. She'd hired a private investigator who had documented the Park City trip and other meetings between Jake and Hazel, gathering evidence that she was now using in divorce proceedings where Hazel was being named as a contributing factor to the breakdown of a 15-year marriage with 3 children involved. When confronted with this undeniable evidence by concerned friends who thought she should take responsibility for her actions and their consequences, Hazel doubled down on her victim narrative and refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing or accountability for the damage she'd caused. She claimed that I had driven her to seek comfort elsewhere through my controlling and suspicious behavior, essentially arguing that my normal response to her secretive and deceptive actions had somehow justified her decision to have an affair with a married man. She began a more aggressive campaign to damage my reputation in our shared social and professional circles, spreading rumors about my mental health and emotional stability while portraying our entire relationship as emotionally abusive and psychologically damaging to her well-being. The irony of someone who had systematically gaslighted me for months now claiming to be the victim of emotional abuse was not lost on our mutual friends, but it still hurt to know that she was actively trying to destroy my character and professional reputation as retaliation for my refusal to enable her deception any longer. I found myself having to defend my sanity and emotional stability to people who'd known me for years, explaining that my supposed paranoia and controlling behavior had actually been normal responses to being systematically lied to and manipulated by someone I trusted completely. The experience of having my reality questioned and my character attacked for noticing obvious deception was exhausting and infuriating, but it also validated my decision to leave rather than continue trying to make the relationship work despite the fundamental dishonesty and disrespect. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in relationships and emotional manipulation, needing professional help to process what I'd experienced and to understand why I doubted my own perceptions for so long instead of trusting my instincts about Hazel's obviously deceptive behavior. The therapist helped me understand that what I'd experienced was called reactive abuse, where the victim of manipulation starts exhibiting behaviors that look controlling or paranoid but are actually normal responses to being systematically deceived and gaslighted by someone they trust. She explained that people who engage in sustained deception often use their partner's natural reactions to that deception as evidence that the partner is unstable or controlling, creating a cycle where the victim begins to doubt their own sanity and judgment while the manipulator maintains moral authority and control over the narrative of the relationship. Within 3 months of my departure, Hazel's affair with Jake became public knowledge throughout Salt Lake City's interconnected creative community, creating professional consequences that extended far beyond her personal relationships and social circle. Jake's wife had decided to include Hazel in her divorce proceedings as a named party, citing her role as a contributing factor to the breakdown of their marriage and providing documented evidence of the affair that made the situation impossible for Hazel to deny or minimize. The photography community in Salt Lake City was smaller and more interconnected than Hazel had apparently realized, and news of her involvement in destroying a marriage with 3 young children spread quickly through professional networks and social media groups. Several wedding clients canceled their photography contracts upon learning about the affair, with brides expressing concerns about having someone with questionable moral character document what they considered the most important day of their lives. The cancellations created significant financial damage to Hazel's freelance business, forcing her to scramble for replacement bookings while dealing with negative reviews and word-of-mouth warnings that made it increasingly difficult to attract new clients in her primary market. The professional reputation she'd spent years building was crumbling as potential clients chose photographers who hadn't been publicly involved in marriage-destroying affairs, and she began seriously considering relocating her business to a different city where her personal drama wouldn't follow her into every professional interaction. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my geothermal consulting work with renewed focus and energy, channeling the emotional turmoil from the breakup into professional achievement and career advancement that had been stalled while I was dealing with relationship stress and constant worry about Hazel's behavior. I led a successful project implementing geothermal heating systems for a new residential development outside Salt Lake City, demonstrating technical expertise and project management skills that established my reputation as a rising expert in renewable energy infrastructure throughout Utah. The project's success led to additional consulting opportunities with commercial developers and municipal governments interested in sustainable energy solutions, creating a professional trajectory that was more promising and fulfilling than anything I'd accomplished while trying to maintain a relationship built on deception and manipulation. 6 months after leaving Hazel, I began attending a support group for people who'd experienced emotional manipulation and gaslighting in relationships, finding it helpful to connect with others who understood the specific psychological damage that comes from having your reality constantly questioned by someone you trust. The group helped me recognize patterns I'd missed and develop strategies for maintaining healthy boundaries in future relationships, teaching me to trust my instincts and observations rather than automatically deferring to a partner's version of reality when conflicts arose. I started dating again after 8 months, approaching new relationships with clearer boundaries and better awareness of manipulation tactics, but also with increased confidence in my own judgment and emotional intelligence. The experience with Hazel had been devastating, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about recognizing deception early and maintaining my sense of self even when someone I loved was actively working to undermine my confidence and perception of reality. My new dating approach was more careful and deliberate, but also more authentic because I was no longer willing to compromise my core values or ignore obvious inconsistencies in order to preserve a relationship that wasn't built on mutual respect and honesty. I found myself attracted to women who were straightforward about their feelings and intentions, who didn't require me to interpret mixed signals or decode contradictory behavior, and who demonstrated through actions rather than just words that they valued honesty and transparency in relationships. My confidence continued to grow as I realized that trusting my instincts and maintaining my standards had led to the best possible outcome, despite the initial pain and disruption of ending what I'd thought was a serious long-term relationship with potential for marriage and shared future. 2 years after discovering those devastating text messages on Hazel's phone, I found myself engaged to Paige Chen, a brilliant renewable energy lawyer I'd met at a clean technology conference in Denver where we'd both been presenting on sustainable infrastructure development in the Mountain West region. Paige was everything Hazel hadn't been, straightforward about her feelings, transparent about her schedule and friendships, and genuinely appreciative of my emotional intelligence and commitment to honest communication in relationships. She never made me feel paranoid or controlling for asking about her day or wanting to understand her work projects and social commitments, because she understood that healthy relationships are built on transparency and mutual interest in each other's lives rather than secretive independence that excludes your partner from basic information. Our engagement came naturally after 18 months of dating, growing out of shared values and compatible life goals rather than desperate attempts to salvage something fundamentally broken or dishonest. Through mutual connections in Salt Lake City's professional networks, I learned that Hazel had eventually moved to Phoenix after her photography business failed completely in Utah, unable to rebuild her professional reputation after the affair scandal had permanently damaged her credibility in the wedding industry. She'd apparently repeated similar patterns of deception and manipulation in 2 subsequent relationships that ended badly, confirming that her behavior with me hadn't been an aberration or temporary confusion but rather a consistent pattern of how she approached intimate relationships when they became inconvenient or limiting to her desires. The cycle of finding financially stable men who supported her lifestyle and dreams, then growing resentful of their expectations for honesty and commitment, seemed to be her standard operating procedure rather than specific issues she'd had with me personally. Last month, Hazel attempted to reach out through a mutual friend's wedding where we were both working in professional capacities, me as a guest and consultant for the venue's geothermal system, her as a hired photographer who'd traveled back to Utah for what was probably a desperate attempt to rebuild her business connections. She sent a message through the bride saying she understood now what had gone wrong between us and wanted to apologize, claiming she'd grown and learned from her mistakes and hoped we could have closure about our relationship. I chose not to respond to her overture, recognizing that her desire for closure was about alleviating her own guilt and possibly testing whether I might be available for reconciliation now that her other relationships had failed, rather than making genuine amends for the systematic deception and emotional manipulation she'd put me through. My therapist had taught me that people who've manipulated others often seek contact years later when their lives aren't going well, hoping to reconnect with stable partners they'd previously taken for granted or discarded for more exciting options. Standing in my new home that evening after the wedding, Looking at engagement photos where both Paige and I were genuinely smiling with the easy confidence of people who trust each other completely, I reflected on how leaving when trust was broken had been the best decision I'd ever made. That experience taught me that real love is built on transparency and mutual respect rather than on convincing someone to ignore their instincts or accept behavior that makes them feel crazy and insecure. I learned to value partners who make relationships feel easy and honest rather than dramatic and uncertain, and to recognize that someone who truly loves you won't make you feel paranoid for noticing obvious inconsistencies in their behavior or stories. Most importantly, I discovered that trusting myself and maintaining my standards was more valuable than preserving any relationship that required me to compromise my sense of reality or accept systematic deception as the price of love and companionship.